So this is where we left. Just in the previous section, I said that we'll get started with the database, but I'd like to take a quick break and organize this code base. So let's make this a little bit more cleaner by following the best practices. So this is how you would do as a complete beginner, right? Without knowing anything, you would just put your entire code under the server.js, which is fine, but if the project gets really large, this is going to be unmanageable. So what you would like to do, take all these functions, routes, and put them under different folders and files. Because if you think about it, maybe this function will be around 50 lines of code. This will be 70 lines of code, so on and so forth. This file will get 1000 lines of code, and you cannot really manage it. So what you can do instead, let's delete these spaces. We can take every single one of these routes under different folders. So I'll create one called routes. Let's create a file called nodes route, or let's say nodes routes.js. You can call this anything, but this is one of the conventions that we have. Okay, so at first this will look a little bit complicated, but please follow along with me for the next 2 minutes and then everything will make sense. So here in this file, you would like to import express because we'll be doing something. Let's say import the express, and we would like to create a router. Let's say use express.router. Okay, just make sure that R is capitalized. And then we can say export this one. I'll say export default router. Now we can put our endpoints. So first, let's just save. We'll add something here. And let's try to comment all of them. Now, just before I comment this, I'd like to mention something. So here in this file, if you have realized, every single one of these routes has something in common, which is /API/nodes. So instead of typing this out on every single route, we can just remove it and only type it out only once. Okay, so I'll just comment this out and I'll say, just maybe at the very beginning, right after the app, and I'll delete this comment. We don't really need it. If you wanted to, you can put it in your notes, but I'll delete that. Okay, so I'll say app.use. So you would use .use without any methods, because we will take these methods and put it under the routes. So let's say if we got a request to /API/nodes, if it starts with this one, we would like to hit this file, which is something that we can import. Let's say import nodes routes from, let's go into the routes and visit this file. Just make sure to put the .js at the end. Okay, so I'll say get this file. Now let's take every single one of them. I'll basically cut this, save, and go into this file. Now let's try to create these. So instead of app.get, we'll say router.get. And you can put the exact same thing, but we don't really want to put this /API/nodes because it is already prefixed. Again, this will make sense. Just for now, follow along with me. We'll just say only / and then we can get this method and put it right here. Let's try to delete the comments. Okay, so that's it for the very first route, which was this one, right? Where we can get the nodes. Let's say you just fetched the nodes. Okay, we'll do the exact same thing for these ones. If you wanted to, you can pause the video and do so. I'll say router.post. Again, instead of app, you would say router.post. You don't really need to type this out. It is already added. We'll just say /, and then we'll get this part, which is our handler function. Let's delete the comments, save, and I'll be doing the same thing for these ones. Let's copy it, paste it. Probably this is what we should be doing until now. Let's say router, but just delete this part because it is already included, right? /API/nodes. We already have this. It is prefixed, but we would like to add the /id at the end. Now this should be making sense completely. And then I'll get these two as well. We don't really need to put, we just put that. And then let's say router.delete. And again, we already have this, so we can just leave this part. Okay, so let's say kill the left-hand side and put them side by side. Let's see what we have just did. So it's really clear what we have done, right? We basically take all those previous endpoints and prefix them with /API/nodes. So if you send a request to /API/nodes, you're gonna hit this and you would get this response. If you hit with a post request, you would get this response. If you hit /API/nodes/SOMEID with the put method, you would get this response, and same for the delete. I hope all makes sense, right? Let's actually test this out. If we just visit this part with a GET request, we should be able to get this response. So I'll go right here. I'll say /API/nodes. Let's refresh. We just fetched the nodes. Let's try to say it'll be /API/nodes/something. Let's do it. Say, if you refresh now, this should say cannot found, but let's say /something. Okay, so I hope that makes sense. We just link them by prefixing this. So that was the very first thing that we have done. Now again, what we can do, even organize this even more, because if you think about it, these functions can get really large, right? What we would like to do, just take them and put as a separate file and folder. This is what we call a controller, right? We have a bunch of different controllers. So this is the first one, second one, so on and so forth. Let's create the controllers, and these controllers will be for the nodes. Let's say nodes controller.js, and then basically we will cut them one by one. So I'll just cut this. Let's paste this in, and let's call this as a function. So you can create it as an arrow function. Let's say const get all nodes. Okay, this is the function. Now we can export it. Let's say get all nodes, and make sure to put the .js at the end. If you wanted to, you can make this as a regular function as well. Let's do it pretty quickly. I'll say we will export this function. Let's say export function get all nodes. We would delete this part and this one. Okay, this is the other way of writing it. Let's just have it as a function or arrow function. It doesn't really matter. And you can mark them as async if you really wanted to. It's just a regular function, right? So you can call it as async or not, depending on what you'll be doing with it. Okay, now we can get this one. I know that we are going slowly, but I just don't really want to rush. Let's just go slowly. I'll go ahead and duplicate this one. Let's say create a node, or let's just say create node, and I'll just paste what we have copied. I'll just leave the response. Okay, let's do the same thing for this one. I'll say create node, import it from this file. This is to update a node. I'll say export function, paste this in, give it a name like update node, and let's try to do the same thing for the delete. Say delete node, and I'll get the response. Let's cut this and paste this in. Okay, we would like to import them now. Delete this entire thing. I'll delete the extra spaces. Okay, so what we have done is basically take these controllers and put it under the specific file. So everything should be working as exactly as it was before. Now the beauty of this code base is that later at some point, let's say you want to add some stuff related to products. You can basically create this route and create this file. Let's say it'll be product routes. So you can add your product routes under a specific file. Let's say you will have another one for, let's say, posts. Maybe you're building some social media application. You would add, let's say, something related to payments. You would add something like emails. So you get the point. This file otherwise would be incredibly large, but now it's just only 5 lines of code where you just separated every single service into its own file. Okay, so I hope all makes sense. And we even more optimized it by creating this controller file. So that's kind of it for this section I was going to say. But one more thing, one of the best practices is to create a source folder. So you can create this one and put everything related to application under the source. So just go ahead, put the controllers and the routes as well as the server.js file. But if you do so, you will notice that your application will crash. Now, why is that? Can you spot? Well, it's because under the scripts, you say run the server.js file, but now it is under the source folder, right? It's not under the backend. So you would like to say it's under the source. Let's fix this one as well. And you don't really have to fix this part, but let's be consistent. And let's say our main entry point is the server.js file, which is under the source folder. Okay, so if you save, kill the terminal and run this from scratch, it should be working properly. Okay, so that's kind of it for the optimization section. So with that, in the next section, we'll get started with the database. Alright, so in this section, we are going to get started with the MongoDB, which is going to be our database. It's completely free to get started with. You don't really need to pay anything, or you don't even need to provide with your credit card. So head over to mongodb.com and create an account. I have already done this, so I'll go ahead and log in. I have logged in with my Google account. It'll just redirect me to the dashboard. Okay, so we will create a project in a second. But first, let's go over these nodes that I have. We basically have 3 different comparisons between SQL databases versus NoSQL databases. So MongoDB is a NoSQL database, and then we have some SQL databases like Postgres or let's say MySQL, so on and so forth. And for the NoSQL databases, we have other examples like Cassandra or let's say Neo4j, so on and so forth. Okay, so in SQL databases, data is stored in tables with rows and columns. So it is like a spreadsheet. And then in NoSQL databases, they store data like JSON or key value pairs, which is good for changing data shapes. So the SQL databases are a little bit more strict when it comes to how you store the data, but NoSQL databases are a little bit more flexible. And then the SQL databases use SQL language, so you would use things like select, insert, so on and so forth. But when it comes to NoSQL databases, they would use a query language. And each NoSQL database has its own way of querying, often simpler and faster for certain tasks. And we're going to see this once again. And then finally, you might be asking, when do we use a SQL database and when do we use a NoSQL database? So you would use a SQL database whenever you need like complex queries, or let's say you have a lot of relationships in your application. So to give an example, let's say you are building a really large social media application where you have a bunch of different relations between your data, right? So this could be a perfect example to use a SQL database. Or let's say you are building a really large or just a bank application, right? Everything has to be really strict and you have a bunch of relations. And when it comes to NoSQL databases, so it is great for fast changing data or huge amounts of data. So these are the things that you can keep in mind. But as a beginner, it doesn't really matter if you use MongoDB or Postgres or MySQL, right? All you want at the moment is to have a place where you can store the data and interact with it, manipulate it, so on and so forth, right? Okay, I hope that makes sense. So with all this in mind, we can head over to dashboard and create a new project. So here I'll just say view all my projects, and then I'll create a new one. Let's call this as thinkboard. Let's say next, create the project where we need to create a cluster. So we'll go with the free plan. Okay, so let's say create a deployment. I'll leave everything as it is. Okay, come on. Let me go over this AI check. Once it is done, you will be redirected to this page. Let's copy the password. So just make sure you copy it. Let's say create the database user and then choose a connection method. So we will connect to our database from our Node.js application. So let's select the drivers option. Okay, so the first option is to select your driver and version. We'll just leave them as it is. The second step is to install MongoDB. But instead of using the MongoDB driver, we'll be using something called Mongoose. So let's search for it. Okay, we'll be using this. It's a lot more cleaner and it'll give some strict rules where we can have our schema, the schema validation, which is something that we'll get into. So we can skip this step. And finally, once it is done, like they will provide you a connection string. Now that we got this, we can copy it. I'll have the password open so that it is included. I'll just copy it. If you cannot see your password, it would look like this, and you would delete this part, paste your password that we have just copied a couple of seconds ago. But probably you have this option. So go ahead, turn this on, copy it, and paste it to your code base. For now, just put it under the server.js. We'll be using it. Okay, so we can just say done, and we can actually get started with it. Now, just before we connect to this database, I would like to go under the network access. So currently, this would include your current IP address. From this IP address, you can connect to this database, but we don't really want to get any errors. So I'll say add an IP address where we can access from anywhere, right? So I'll say confirm. This will take around 10 to 15 seconds. Once it is done, it should be active. Okay, so it's done, it's active. In my case, it took around 30 seconds, but now we are good to go. Let's go under the clusters. Let's say browse collections, but obviously we don't really have anything, right? 0 databases and 0 collections. So let's use this connection string where we can connect to our database. But before we do so, let's open up the terminal. Let's kill the backend. Just make sure you are under the backend. And as I said, we'd like to use Mongoose. So I'll say npm install, you would say Mongoose, and you would press enter normally, but let's use a specific version, as I said, at the beginning, so that if you're watching this tutorial at a future date, like it should still work as expected. So I'll go with 7.0.3. We'll go with this version. Let's install it. Okay, now we can clear the terminal and say npm run dev. Okay, now let's copy this connection string and try to connect to our database. I'll just cut this, and to be able to connect to my database, I would like to create a specific folder where we can put our configurations. So I'll say config, and let's say db.js file. Here we'll create a function where we can connect to the database. So I'll say const connect db, and this will be an async function, let's say. And we'll have a try and catch block. In the try, we would like to connect our database successfully, but if we got some errors, we'll hit the catch where we can just add a console log. Now, first thing I'd like to do is importing, let's say import mongoose from the mongoose package. Okay, so it's really easy to connect to your database. All you have to say mongoose.connect and then put your connection string. So I'll just paste this in. Now this will take a little bit of time, so we'd like to await this, and then once this is done, let me just kill the left hand side. I'll say console log, let's say MongoDB connected successfully. Okay, and in the catch we can add another console log. Let's even say console.error. I'll say error connecting to MongoDB, and then we can put the error.message, or let's just put the error itself. Now let's try to save this and try to call this method. So I'll say export this from this file, and under the server.js we can just call that method. So I'll say call the connect db, and just make sure to put the .js at the end. Now let's save and take a look at the terminal. Okay, MongoDB connected successfully. Now if you try to break this, right, I'll just delete the some part of the password. Now it is wrong. Okay, here we can see we got an error. It says bad authentication. The authentication has failed. So we hit the catch block. As you can tell, it says error connecting to MongoDB, and then we would see the error itself. So I'll do Ctrl Z, bring this back, and we are good to go. Now, the other thing that you would like to do in the catch block, if you got some errors, you would like to exit the process. So you'll say process.exit, and the status code is going to be 1. Now, 1 means exit with failure. Okay, but if you had 0, that means success. But since we are in the catch block, this is going to be 1, which means failure. Now let's save this code and take a look at our database. So I'll try to refresh this page. We should see some kind of a database, or we cannot really see it because we didn't really create any data or any collections. But the problem that I'm trying to mention is that we didn't really give a name for our database, right? This is currently called as test, okay? So if we don't put anything, your database will be test. But let's try to update it. I'll say nodes_db, and you would put your database name just before the question mark. So this is something to keep in mind. We just updated that. And once we create a database, once it is visible in this dashboard, I'll mention this once again, we will see this name. Now you might be thinking this code is perfectly fine, but it's not really. Because if you deploy this code to GitHub, if someone opens up your db.js file, they can see your connection string and they can use it, like they can connect your database because they're able to see your username and your password. So what you'd like to do, cut this from here and put it somewhere else. And this is where the .env file comes into play. So under the backend, let's shrink everything. We will create the .env file and we can put our connection string. So I'll say mongo_URI, and let's say this will be equal to this value. We can delete the quotes. Okay, just paste this in as the string that you have just cut it. Okay, let's save. Now, how do we use this value? How do we get this key and then the value? So to be able to use this, you need to get a package. Let's open up the terminal. I'll say npm install.env. So this is a package that allows you to get access to environment variables. So this is what we call an environment variable, by the way. Now that we have installed the package, let's run the app. So I think we are getting a deprecation warning. This is something that we can take a look at it in a second. For now, just ignore this. It's not really important. And it has nothing to do with the .env package. So for now, just ignore that. We'll go under the server.js. Let's try to configure the .env package. Now, why do we need it? So if you currently say console log process.env and then your environment variable name, now this will give you undefined in the terminal. So here you can see you cannot read this value. To be able to use it, you need to say import .env from the .env package. Let's type this out. And then you would say .env.config. Call this method. Once you have done this, you should be able to get that value instead of undefined, right? Previously it was undefined, but now we can get the value. And if you put this something wrong, let's just add 1, 2, 3. Okay, it's not gonna work. It's undefined because you have to put this name. So now that you know how to access the environment variables, let's cut it from here and we will add it right here. So let me delete the spaces. I'll say process.env.mongo_URI. Okay, now we are going to hide this file in GitHub so that no one can see our connection string, right? This is now a secret environment variable. Okay, so I hope that makes sense. I'll just try to go over it pretty quickly once again. So we didn't really put our connection string as it is. Instead, we take it and put it under the .env file so that it is a secret. No one can see it other than us. It is only it's only available locally in our machine. If we deploy our code to GitHub, we will hide this file with a gitignore file, which is something that we'll do at the end of this video. So no one can see this value. Okay, so this is that file that you need for the secret variables. And to be able to use it, we have installed this package called .env, and then we call the config method to be able to properly use it. Now, another convention is to get your port and put it under the .env. So this is exactly what I'll be doing. I'll just say port, all uppercase, and I'll put this value. Now you don't have to do it, but I would recommend it. So let's get this value. I'll say const port, which is going to be coming from the .env, say port. And if, let's say this is undefined, we can add this fallback value. So if this is equal to false or undefined, we will get this value. Now let's put this in. I'll just say use this port, and we can add this dynamic value. So I'll just say add the port at the end. Okay, so this is going to work as exactly as it was before, but we just updated our code. Now, what's up with this error? I don't really know. I think it's because of the Mongoose package. Maybe this version is causing this. So what I'll be doing is kill the backend. Let's say npm install mongoose at latest. Okay, now it's been updated. So in your case, just don't type at latest. Go ahead, put this version. Okay, so just say npm install mongoose and paste this in. It should update it. Now let's try to run the app. Hopefully you'll get rid of that error or the warning. Okay, now we don't really have that warning that we got previously. And for the .env, by the way, I think I just said npm install .env. Go ahead, add this at the end. If you have already done this, it's completely fine. Just do it once again, add this at and the version itself. And then you can start your backend. Okay, so server started and then MongoDB connected successfully. Now the next thing that we would like to do is to create a model. So let's try to create this folder called models, and we'll have only one model that will be Node.js. So this is one of the conventions where you capitalize the very first letter and you put it as a singular, right? So you don't say nodes. Instead, it is the Node.js. So we will create a model for the node because let me show you the end result. Here we have some screenshots. So every single node has some values like a title, a description, right? This is the description of the node, and then we have things like created at date and updated at. So these are the things that we would like to store, and let's create the model so that we know which fields a node will have. I know that it might not make too much sense, but let's see this in action. The first thing you would like to do is to import the mongoose from the mongoose package, and then you would first create a schema. So let's say first you would create a schema, and then second you would create a model based off of that schema. Let's see how that works. So first let's create the schema. I'll say const node schema. You can call this anything, but this is the name that I'll have. I'll say new mongoose.schema, and this wants you to add an object. So here we will put our fields. Let's say every single node will have a title, which is going to be type of string. So let's just say type is going to be string, and then we can say it'll be required. So every single node has to has a title. Let's say required will be equal to true. And then the other fields that we would like to have is the content, which is the description. I'll call it as content. You can call this anything, but I would say just follow along with me. So put the content, let's say, again, type will be string, and then it'll be required as well. So I'll just duplicate that and put this in. Now the other thing we would like to have is the created at field, so that we can put the created at right here in the node. So you can type this out manually, right? You can say created at and put this as a date, but the better option is to add another object. So here just say timestamps will be equal to true. Okay, so MongoDB by default will give you the created at and updated at fields if you add this timestamps of true. And I would highly recommend you to add this option in your schemas. Okay, now that we have the schema, we can create the model based off of this schema. So I'll say const node. Again, it should be capitalized and singular, right? Let's say mongoose.model. Call this as node, and just take a look at the schema that we have. Then we'll say export default this model. So what this says, basically create a node model based off of this schema. So every single node will have a title, it'll have a content, and then it'll add the timestamp whenever they create it. So we'll be using this node in other files to be able to interact with the nodes, where we can create one, update one, delete, so on and so forth. Okay, so just go ahead, save this file, and we should be good to go. And I have just updated these comments so that you can have it in the source code. Alright, so that's gonna be it for this section, where we have created a database, connect to it, and then we have created our model, right? And finally, we also learned about the .env package, where we can access our environment variables so that we can keep our secrets separately from our codebase. Okay, so that's gonna be it for this section. In the next one, we can get started with our actual controllers. They are currently just hard-coded. They are a test. We would like to obviously communicate with our database, where we can fetch them, create them, update, and delete. Okay, so with this in mind, I'll see you in the next section. Alright, so this is where we left. In the last section, we have connected to our database. Now we'll get started with the controllers that we have. So this is the very first one, where we would like to get every single node. Currently, we don't really have anything in the database, so this should return something like an empty array, right? So let's first get started with the code and just see how we can create this controller. So first, I'll mark this as async because we'll have some promises. So let's delete this part. I'll say try and catch block. Now in the try, we can just fetch every single node. I'll say const nodes, and let's say await, import the node model that we have. Let's import it. Say from, just go under the, maybe just above, under the models, and get this Node.js. Once again, make sure to include the extension at the end. Now we will say node.find, which is going to give you every single node. If you wanted to fetch some specific ones, you can add this filter, but we basically want to get every single one of them. And then let's say as the response, we can send the status code of 200, and we can say JSON, just send the nodes. In the catch, that means the server failed, right? If we hit the catch block, we can say res.status of 500. This is something that we have told in the past, and we'll just say JSON for the message. We can say something like internal server error, and for debugging purposes, you can put the error in the console. So I'll say console.error. Let's say error and get all nodes method, or let's say controller, and then just put the error itself. Okay, let's try to test this out. Now we can send a GET request from our browser, right? You can visit /API/nodes, just send a request. We got a response of an empty array, right? And we can use something else in a desktop application called Postman, which is completely free to get started with. This is what I have. So I have already installed it. I'll just go ahead and get this. Okay, so it will start the application. Now, thanks to this application, we can send put request, post request, so on and so forth, right? So these are the things that I have done in the past. Let's create something new. Let's say send an HTTP request to our endpoint. Now we can copy our URL. Let's go right here. It'll be a GET request, and then send the request. We got an empty array. Now let's try to break something in our code. So here I'll just say find, I don't know, like find X, which is a method that we don't have. Is our application crashed? No, it didn't. Let's try to send the request. Okay, as you can tell, we got the message, internal server error. The status code is equal to 500. Okay, so this is how that works. Let me try to zoom in, and I'll just maximize the screen. So that was the very first thing that we have built, the very first controller. the next one, the other one that I'd like to create is going to be this one. So let's go ahead and delete the content and get started with it. And I'd like to mark all of these as async. Let's say async function. Now, before we write any code, let's think about it. If user wants to create a node, they need to send a title as well as a content, right? Let's pretty quickly see this in action. So right here under the create page, if they want to create a node, they need to pass the title as well as the content. So how do we get these values from the user? So we'll go under the VS Code. Let's first get the try catch block. So let's say we'd like to grab the title, reach all the structure, let's say title and content. This is going to be coming from request.body. But if you try to say console log the title and the body, by default this would be undefined. So to be able to use this, and this should be content by the way. Okay, so by default you cannot access this value. If you want to access them, you need to head over to server.js, and just before your routes you would say app.use express.json, which is a middleware that we add. So let's say middleware. Now we'll talk about the middleware in detail. For now, just know that this is something needed. Let's try to use it, and then I'll explain this on a diagram, I promise. Okay, so just make sure to add it before your routes. Now let's try to get these values where we'd like to create a node. I'll say const, let's say new node, and this is going to be our new node. We'll call the model where we'd like to add the title. Let's say it'll be equal to this, and then the content will be equal to the content that user passes. Since the key and value is the same thing, we can shorten this. And then let's try to save it to the database. So we just created it. We'll say await new node dot save. And then we can send the response. Let's say status is going to be equal to 201. Again, this is something that we have talked about previously. The response could be, let's say, I'll just add the message for now. Let's say node created successfully. And for the catch block, I'll do the exact same thing. So I'll copy paste, let's say error in create node controller. Okay, let's try to see this in action. We would like to send a post request, right? If you take a look at it, it is the post request. So let's go under the postman. I'll say post. Now we would like to send some body. Let's select this and just say it'll be row, then JSON. Okay, so just try to type this out with me. We'll have the title, let's say my first node. And then for the content, I'll say some content. Okay, let's try to send the request. Node created successfully. We got the status code. Let's take a look at the database if this is the case, right? Let's just double check. Okay, so we got the database name, which is the nodes_db. Then we got the collection where we have our very first document. And as you can tell, the MongoDB has added these timestamps by default, and it also adds an _ID field by default, right? So you don't really need to add an ID by yourself. And I have said in the past that I'll show you this nodes_db. Now this is coming from it is coming from right here, right? I said this would be your database name. If you don't put anything here, this would be called as test. Okay, so just keep this in mind. So now that we have created a node, if we send a request to here, and by the way, let's fix this, we should be able to get all the nodes that we have. So I'll go here, send the get request. Okay, so we just have only one node. This is the response that we got. Now let's try to create another node. So here I'll just go into this one. Let's say my second node, and let's say some content 1, 2, 3. Instead of getting this message, we can maybe show the created node. So for this, I'll go into VS Code. Okay, so instead of sending this message, first I'll say this is going to be called as node. Let's say node.save, which is going to give us, let's say, the saved node. And we can return this as the response. I'll just say return the saved node. Okay, so this is something optional, but I think now this should be a little bit more clean. Let's say my third node and add some content. Okay, so this is what we got. Instead of that message, we actually see the created node. Now, how do I update a node? So let's say I want to update this one where I'd like to update the content. So I would create a put request. Here, what it says, sign up to save your work remotely. We don't really want to do it. Let's say I'll get this as the put request. So instead of this content, let's say I'll have the updated content. And I'll just leave the title as it is so I can delete that. Now, if I want to update this one, I need to get the ID and put it into the URL, right? So API nodes, and this is the one that I'd like to update. And this is how we set that up. Here we can see we are expecting a put request to this like API nodes / whatever the ID is. And then we will run this method. So let's try to build it. I'll say try and catch block, where we'd like to get the title as well as the content from the request.body. So I'll say request.body. This will give us some data, which is going to be title as well as the content. And then we'll say await, let's say node.findById and update. Now we need to pass the ID. Here you can tell it says the very first thing that you need to pass will be the ID. But how do we get the ID from the URL, right? How do we know this is the ID that user sends us? So we can say something like request.params.id. So we call this as ID because this is what we called it. Here, if you said hello, then you should say request.params.hello, right? So these names should match. Now that we have this in mind, the first thing that we need to pass is the ID so that we know which node that we are updating and then the fields that we would like to update. So we'll say update the title as well as the content. So let's say title, just pass this and pass the content itself. Now let's say res.json. Once this is done completely, successfully, we can say res.status. Let's say 200, it is success. And for the JSON, we can say message node updated successfully. And in the catch, I'll go ahead, copy this, paste it. Let's say error in update node controller. Okay, let's try to save and give it a go. I'll go ahead, add this put method. Now we didn't really pass the title. Let's see what'll happen. Or maybe first, let's try to add the title. I'll not change the title. Let's add a comma right here. Send the request. Node updated successfully. Let's take a look at the database. I'll just try to refresh. Let me zoom out. So we got 3 different documents and the third one has been updated. This is the content that we have. Now what happens if user puts an ID that does not exist? So in this case, let's try to handle it. Here, just before we send the response, here I'll say const updated node. Now I'll say if updated node is not found, right? Let's say updated node, if this is equal to a falsy value, we would like to say return out of this function with the status code of 404, which means not found. And then I'll say JSON, we can send a message such as node not found. And there is one more thing. Once you update something, at the end, you would like to add this option called new equal to true. Now this is optional, but let's save. And if you hover over this, just read it out loud, you will understand what that does. Basically, I'll try to summarize it. Once you add this, it'll give you the new node with the updated fields. I hope that makes sense. And then now let's try to save and send the request with an invalid ID. So this is the previous one. Now let's put 45, which is something that we don't have in the database. Okay, node not found. We got 404. Nothing has been updated in the database. Let's bring this back. Let's say updated content 123. Since we have the node, we can we can update it successfully. And instead of returning this message, I will send the updated node in the response. Okay, so I'll try to update it once again to this content. Okay, so this is the response that we got. Now you might be asking, do I have to add the title as well as the content? So let's try to delete one of them. So I just deleted the title. I'll say updated content 123, send the request. Now, as you can tell, title has not changed. This is what we had previously. Let's try to refresh the database and take a look at the title as well as the content. So it'll only update what you have passed. In this case, we only passed the content, so it has been updated only. Okay, then we are going to add the very last controller where we can delete it. So maybe you can pause the video and try to build it by yourself. It'll be similar to this one that we have built. For the method, we have something like find by ID and delete. Okay, so just pause the video and try to do so. Then we can watch my solution. So I will say await node.find by ID and delete. How do we know which node we would like to delete? Where we can get, well, we can get the ID from the URL. So here I'll say request.params.id, and then this would give us the deleted node. Let's say deleted node. We can check for it, just like what we have done here. I'll say if there is not deleted node, that means node not found. User put an invalid ID. We can return this response, but else we can say res.json. You can either return this one or a message such as node deleted successfully. And if you don't send a status, by default it'll be 200. So let's try to see this in action. In the catch, we can copy and paste this one. It's pretty classic. We'll just say error and delete node controller. Okay, so let's try to delete the third node. I'll get the ID, send the delete request. We don't really need to send a body. I'll say none. Send the request. It has been deleted successfully. And here we can see we got the 200 by default, even if we didn't pass it. But I think it's fine to just put this explicitly, right? So I'll just put it as a 200 right here in my code just to be consistent. Okay, so I just saved the file and we have built every single controller that we would need. But I'd like to add one more where we can just fetch a specific node. So we have a get method where we can get all the nodes, but here I'll duplicate this and I'll add the ID. Let's say user wants to fetch a specific node. So here I'll say get node by ID. Let's try to create this controller. I'll copy the name right after this one. We can say export async function. Put the name where we can get the request and response. And here let's try to import it. Okay, now let's try to build it. It'll be really simple as well. All we want to do, just get the ID from the URL and fetch that node specifically. So here I'll say const node await node.find by ID, which is going to be this one, and then we'll say if we don't have the node, we can return res.status of 404. I'll say JSON is going to be equal to message of node not found. But in the else case, we can say res.json, just return the node itself. In the catch, it'll be classic. Now there is even a better way of handling the catch blocks. So you don't really put the try and catch. Instead, you would create some kind of a wrapper function, but it's a little bit more advanced. So I'll just skip that in this tutorial. Okay, so for now, it's completely fine to use these try and catch blocks. There is nothing wrong with it. I'll put this console.error and let's try to see this in action. Let's say I'll get every single node, but now let's say I want to get my first node specifically. I'll copy this ID let's create a get method. Here maybe I'll just update my URL. Okay, so instead of getting every single one of them, I'll get this one specifically. Here we go, we only have this as the response. Now normally we can end the section right here, but there is one more thing that I'd like to mention. So when we send the request where we get every single node, we can sort this, right? So first we get the first one and then the second one. But how can we reverse it so that we can see the latest one at the beginning? So we can go under the controller. Once we say just find all of them, right after this we can say dot sort and then sort them depending on the create that field. So I'll say created. Let's try to type this out correctly. Created, and I'll say -1, which means show the newest first. Okay, by default I think it is 1, but let's try to go with -1. So previously we got the first one and then the second one. Okay, so again we got the same thing. Let's say 1. What are we gonna get? Oops. Okay, do I have a typo? Okay, it should be created at. Let's put -1. Sorry, my bad. So that's why it did not work. This is what we got by default, but if we have -1, we should get the second one at the beginning and then the first one. Okay, by default it is 1. Let's try to see. Okay, so this is something to keep in mind. I'll be using -1 so that in the end result, when we create a new node, I'd like to see this at the beginning, right? So this is the latest one created, and this is the first one that has been created. If you wanted to, you can change the behavior, but this is what I'll have in my implementation. Okay, so I have also updated this comment so that you can have it in the source code. Now, one more thing, if you are not using a variable, just like this one, this is the argument, the request, we declared it, but the value is never read. So what you can do is skip them by adding an underscore. This is one of the conventions that we have. So this is something that you can keep in mind. Okay, so I think that's gonna be it for the entire section where we have built every single controller that we would need. Now in the server.js, we talked about the middlewares and I said we'll get into the details, but that will be in the next section. So for now, just know that we have added this middleware, which is a function basically. It allows us to get access to the request.body. Let me find it. Okay, so it allows us to get access these values that we send as a JSON, right? So when we send the post request, we have added these fields. By default, you cannot access them. They'll give you undefined. But just because we have added before our routes, we are able to use these values. Okay, so I hope that makes sense. That's gonna be it for this section. I'll see you in the next one.